Hello. It's been some time since I've talked about an old divorce case or a rich person or both. Well, it's about time. We're going to talk about the loves of Mr. Asa Candler. Asa Candler of Georgia has studied pharmacy in school and at 21 went to Atlanta with a whole $2.50 in his pocket. He worked at a drugstore until November 1873, when his father had passed away and he returned to the family farm to take charge. Once the farm prospered, he returned to Atlanta and formed a partnership in the drug business. After 4 years of work, he bought out his partner's interest and continued the business on his own for 6 years. Mr. Candler was the original manufacturer of Coca-Cola in April 1888, after having purchased the formula from John Pemberton for about $500. 3 years later, he was the sole owner. He put all of his money and time into it. His first factory was a small shed in which he personally stirred the kettle to make the concoction. His first year's sales were a mere 500 gallons. February 1892, he organized the Coca-Cola Company in Georgia and continued as its leader through 1911 when his son Charles took over. In 1919, he would sell his interest in the company for some $25 million in 1919 terms. You may also know his name from his generous philanthropic giving. In 1907, during what was known as a money panic, he offered to purchase from businessmen property they wanted to sell, but he would not pay them panic prices, aka extremely low, but he would pay at the peak prices prior to this panic era. He paid out some $1.1 million in cash for Atlanta real estate without making their owners sell their souls for it. During World War I, when European cotton was hard to come by, he lent Southern cotton growers some $30 million to help them out. He is also sometimes called the father of the famed Emory University, having donated a lot of money to the institution. He was also mayor of Atlanta at one point. And this is just a handful of his philanthropic work. But enough about his deeds. As you can imagine, people with some cha-ching in their pockets have a hard time with love. True love. Love that ain't gonna cost you all you own. While he was still a mere pharmacist, through his creation of Coca-Cola, and when he would leave the company, he had been married to Lucy Howard. But she would pass away in 1919 after suffering from articular rheumatism for several years. And so began some turmoil in his love life. And keep in mind that at this point in time, Asa ain't young. Mrs. Margaret Hirsch and James Cook. No, this is not really about love, but just about some BS that will sound very familiar as something a rich person would have to endure. During the First World War, and while Candler was mayor, Mrs. Hirsch would show up at his office on the pretense of asking about some Red Cross business, as she was a Red Cross worker. He would say, quote, "I asked Mrs. Hirsch what I could do for her, and she told me she wanted to see me about Red Cross business. She seemed nervous. Suddenly she said, 'Oh, Mr. Candler, there's a man at the window.' I turned around but saw nobody. When I turned back again, Mrs. Hirsch had thrown off her hat and coat and had disarranged her blouse. The next minute, the door burst open and a man stood there. He said, 'This is nice, our honorable mayor and a little society lady.'" End quote. Who was the man? He was called James Cook. The pair demanded some $500,000 from Candler for their silence. Instead of cowing down to them, he had them arrested. Candler would still get charged by Mrs. Hirsch, but the jury would exonerate Candler and charge Mrs. Hirsch with blackmail. She had to pay $1,000 and hang out in the state prison for a year. Her sentence was suspended on the condition that she get her tuchus out of Atlanta, which she did. Cook was also found guilty, got a year's sentence, but skipped bond, and who knows where he ended up. And now we're getting to love messy. Candler at this point in time was about 71, and it's 1922. He would meet a Mrs. Roquet at various Atlanta balls and parties, and then a telegram from Reno would announce she had divorced her husband and was now known by her maiden name, Onezima de Bushel. And pretty much wham bam, Candler would say the pair was engaged to be married. Now, we know marriage and divorces were just so messy back then. One of Candler's brothers was a bishop. You know how Edward VIII marrying the divorced Wallis Simpson was a scandal for which he stepped down from being king? Candler marrying the divorced Onezima was a big deal. The Bishop brother and, from what I understand, the rest of the Candlers weren't happy about this. Pivot! So in the newspapers, all about the scuttlebutt, wanted wedding dates, wedding locations, all of the wedding deets. Well, Onezima would tell them that the wedding would be in San Fran in the fall, and it was still on. But Candler would state, quote, I am quite sure Mrs. de Bushell has been misquoted. The wedding has not been scheduled, nor has San Francisco been selected as a place for the wedding. Beyond this, I do not care to comment. End quote. Ruh-roh. So let's see. She's divorced. Okay. She's Catholic. Okay. Candler didn't care about the religion aspect at all. He really didn't care that she was divorced either. The rest of the Candlers, noting that their own money train was still in love, decided to hire detectives to get the goods on her, as the two above items weren't enough to dissuade him. Did they really not like her, or were they just trying to protect their inheritance, their name? Now, let me say this. When Candler sold off his part of the soda company, which he had already done at this point in time, he got a bunch of money. He gave each of his sons about $5 million, so it's not like they were destitute. Well, what the detectives would find out would indeed seal the deal. Well, actually unseal the deal, prompting Candler to telegraph a letter to his fiancée, ending the engagement, stopping the wedding. Onezima would get on a train to Atlanta to stop the madness, perhaps asking, what the frickety frack? He would not tell her anything further, just that it was over. So what did Candler find out about her? Oh, that she welcomed a man into her hotel room during some sort of event she was attending. And I think we could imagine that if she denied it, he wouldn't believe her. If he located the hotel room man, that man would probably deny it, and Candler wouldn't believe the hotel room man. There was no true proof, but I guess he felt that it was better to rule on the side of caution and end things than to take the risk. And he was not about to name drop the names of the two men who found out this information and told Candler all about it. March 1923. Well, if Onezima is not going to marry Candler, she's going to sue the hell out of him for $500,000 in damages in a federal court. And she's going to say some stuff. Now, Onezima is a divorcee, and she's no slouch. She's experienced some things, and she knows some stuff. She ain't some girl just out of diapers and going to her first Deb ball. She's got social status, she's got property, she's got her own money. That's not to say that perhaps getting more money from the rich Candler wasn't enticing. It's nicer to buy things with someone else's money, right? Someone else's money who was an aged man, he ain't a spring chicken. I'm just assuming some things, and I do feel bad if that wasn't on her mind at all, but don't you know that's what some people were thinking too? You want to know what she swore to officially in court? Well, I'll tell you some of it, because she said a lot. I'll try to provide the juicier details. Onezima, quote, in the year 1922, I, Mrs. Onezima de Bushell of New Orleans, the plaintiff, upon the earnest and repeated solicitation of Mr. Asa Candler, the defendant, entered into a matrimonial engagement with Mr. Candler. I had previously, during the year 1919, made the acquaintance of Mr. Candler when I was attending a reunion of Confederate veterans in the city of Atlanta. Mr. Candler promptly expressed to me his desire to assist in the entertainment of the ladies in attendance upon the reunion, and courteously tendered the hospitality of his home in that connection. I attended a reception given by him to some of the ladies who attended the reunion, and shared the courtesy of his welcome and the generosity of his hospitality. I had occasion to go to Switzerland in the year 1920 as a delegate to attend an international convention convened for the advancement of women's welfare throughout the world. Mr. Candler, the defendant in this present court case, attended me to the dock in New York City to express his wishes for a safe and pleasant journey. Upon my return to America after the adjournment of the convention, Mr. Candler met me at the dock in New York City upon the arrival of my vessel. Throughout this period of the acquaintance, he extended many other courtesies and gave me many proofs of his interest in me." End quote. So they became friends, wrote letters, and she believed from his language that he, quote, "entertained towards me feelings of genuine and permanent regard, interest, and affection." Ultimately, in his letters to me, after fully acquainting me with many circumstances of his private life and the vicissitudes of his public career, Mr. Candler commented upon the loneliness of his home life as a widower and urged me to become his wife. End quote. She goes on to mention her life growing up. She was orphaned when both of her parents died when she was very young. She had no siblings and no blood relations. Though orphaned, she would inherit from her deceased parents' estate to allow her some comfort and to pursue charitable pursuits. Quote, "I believe that a marriage with Mr. Candler would not only ensure my own happiness, but would enable me to render material assistance in making the remaining years of his life as happy as they have ever been, and happier than his lowly condition of widower could be. I thereupon, in good faith, accepted Mr. Candler's offer of marriage. In the course of my correspondence, Mr. Candler frankly informed me that certain members of his family, upon receiving knowledge of his engagement to me, had manifested decided opposition to his purpose to marry me. Mr. Candler made it clear to me that the opposition was not based upon his plan to marry me, but was based upon expressed opposition of the members of his family to his purpose to marry at all." End quote. Well, she would go on to say that she told him she wasn't feeling much comfort from this, that perhaps the engagement should end. Well, he didn't like that and did not want to end the engagement and wanted to proceed. He would tell her that his family had been well provided for already, and I'm sure would continue to be provided for in some manner. He would convince them that all is well and that there was nothing for her to worry about. Quote, "It was not long after I had so acquiesced in Mr. Candler's entreaties that I found new cause to doubt the extent of his influence over the members of his family, and to genuinely suspect that a determined effort was being exerted by them to subordinate him to the influence of their own personal and selfish interests at the expense of his own plans and purposes." End quote. Onezima had primarily lived in New Orleans during her life, and apparently his family visited the city to get some scoop, to release their investigators on every aspect of the city and everyone she had ever known there to find some dirt. Quote, "Mr. Candler promptly acquainted me with the reports received by him as a result of the investigations and proclaimed, with expressions of pride, that the thorough investigations which had been made had merely served to confirm his own high estimate of my character, and to make him feel even more secure in the promise of happiness his anticipated marriage to me would bring into his life." End quote. He wanted her to secure a wedding date. She wanted September 20th, 1922, and it would be in Reno, where she was currently living. She forwarded her furniture to him, as after the wedding they would be living at his home in Atlanta. Announcement cards were made ready to be mailed. He wanted to have a reception at his own house after they returned from their wedding tour. The itinerary of the wedding tour was sent to her for her approval. He had contacted the clergy to perform the ceremony, had ordered the wedding flowers. She bought with her own funds a wedding trousseau, told her friends the wedding date, invited some to the ceremony. Candler was to leave Atlanta the morning of September 16th. And remember, we're train traveling, so a little slow. But we're setting the train brakes because she would receive a note on September 15th that would end everything. Onezima would continue, quote, "In said letter, Mr. Candler wrote your petitioner, her, that it had just been reported to him from sources he was bound to believe that there were two men in Atlanta who declared that they had visited me at my room in a hotel in Atlanta at night on my solicitation, and Mr. Candler, in said letter, declared that on such account the engagement should be broken off. From statements made by Mr. Candler, I discovered, and I now charge, that he thereby meant that the alleged two men referred to in said letter had visited plaintiff, her, at night on her solicitation at the Piedmont Hotel in October 1919 during said Confederate reunion, and for improper purposes. These charges are false." End quote. She would go on to say that this never happened at all in any sense of the word. She goes on to remind everyone that she was ready to end the engagement when he spoke of his family's reticence. But no, he didn't want that. And now this happens at the 11th hour. Quote, I was inexpressibly shocked and humiliated by the unworthy grounds upon which he so abruptly announced his purpose to abandon the wedding which he had arranged. In the letter of September 15th, breaking the engagement, Mr. Candler further declared that on account of the scandalous talk then being circulated in Atlanta against me, I could not come there without slight and insult, and that this ill usage would follow me wherever I might go. Your petitioner, her, having no male relative and thus abandoned by her fiancé, was forced to rely upon my own efforts to vindicate my character and to protect myself against the natural interferences or deductions drawn from the breach of the engagement under these circumstances. I therefore demanded that Mr. Candler furnish me with the names of the men on whose alleged authority said charges had been made. End quote. She goes on to say she wanted this information to vindicate her character by confronting the men on their slanderous statements and to see what kind of potential financial enticements they may have benefited from in order to make said statements, i.e., who paid you off to lie. Quote, to my utter amazement and inexpressible chagrin, my request was refused by Mr. Candler. He refused to furnish me with either the names or addresses of either of the alleged authors of said statements. End quote. She goes on for a bit about his refusal to provide the names, how this lack of information puts her in a bind and not being able to get justice for herself, that he did not do any sort of thorough investigation into these men's statements to ascertain the real truth, that if he was going to charge her with these false accusations, that he had every obligation to tell her who gave him this information. Quote, I therefore bring this action against him for damages in order that the matters herein set out may be freely inquired into and determined by a jury. I allege that the damages I have suffered resulting from Mr. Candler's breach of promise, which damages generally consist of the expense which I have incurred as an incident to said promise, the humiliation, pain, and suffering to which I have been subjected as an incident to its breach, and my financial loss in the premises have been grossly aggravated and increased by the inexcusable conduct of defendant in ruthlessly, recklessly, and wantonly, without any regard whatsoever to my feelings, peace of mind, and future prospects, breaching said promise upon the false charge that I am not a pure, chaste, and virtuous woman, and that my conduct, as set out in his letter breaking said engagement, is such as to unfit me to be his wife. End quote. So the $500,000 is for breach of promises damages. So what could happen? There's always a possibility that his lawyers could try to do a compromise and maybe give her half of the amount. Or if Candler does have evidence in his suit pocket of her indiscretions, this could go to trial as he attempts to justify the broken engagement. Candler has apparently responded to the suit, not really as verbose as Onezima was. He admitted to promising to marry her and breaking the engagement, but that breakage was based on news of her indiscretion. Short and sweet. Well, not sweet. Sorry. June 1923. Candler has gotten himself hitched. Anywho, he's married a Mrs. May Little Reagan, who was a stenographer in the Candler business offices. Her husband dies, she meets Mr. Candler, and they got married. She was born in Sparta, Georgia, and moved to Atlanta some 15 years ago. I think she's about 35, and he's 72. Not judging, I'm just relaying facts. And that's all I got on that. Onezima was, of course, asked about her feelings on this. Quote, I knew nothing whatever of it, and being entirely unconcerned in it, of course I could not say anything about it. End quote. Her lawyer, Harry Gamble, would say, quote, it's news to me. Really, I can't keep up with Mr. Candler's matrimonial engagements. End quote. Ha! Oh, behave. So we're at the end of January 1924. Attorneys for Candler have filed an amendment to their original response to state that at the time of Candler's engagement to Onezima, she was still married? Oh dear. All parties are making their way to Atlanta for the trial. Some 21 letters from Onezima to Candler were being read in court. Now, remember me mentioning that Onezima was living in Reno at one point? Apparently even back then. Reno was the divorce capital of the country, and leading defense attorney W.D. Thompson is stressing those portions of the letter where she went to Reno for the express purpose of getting her divorce and was not intending to permanently reside there, and that she had signed several of her letters as Mrs. Roque, her married name. Well, we've got letters from Candler to Onezima, too. Apparently, he referred to her as Sweetum. We also have some depositions being read regarding Onezima's character. First depo, Dr. Albert Roque, her former brother-in-law. He basically stated that she was a good person with an excellent reputation. Mrs. Brisbane, who had known Onezima for 6 years, said that she had never done anything that could be disapproved. Next was the wife of Dr. Albert Roque, who again was her former brother-in-law. Corinne had known Onezima for some 24 years. Good reputation, etc., etc., etc. These depositions go on for a bit, same information given by all. Some depots from people in Reno were also read, including those that had been visited by some of Candler's detective types. These people could not or would not give out any information to those info seekers. I like this one guy who has had a hotel in Reno. Some man representing Candler's interest had popped by wanting info on Onezima's relations with men. Quote, he said he wanted something detrimental to Mrs. Dayboshel's character, end quote, the deposition said. Quote, what did you tell him? End quote. Quote, I told him I didn't know anything detrimental to her character, end quote. Quote, what else did he say? End quote. Quote, oh, I don't know. I told him to go to hell, end quote. Basically, Candler's letters to her were about the prep work going into the wedding and the travel. Very sweet letters. Until September 15th. There was no greeting to her in that letter. Definitely no dear Sweetum. Candler to Onezima, September 15th. Quote, it almost killed me to have to wire you this morning. Circumstances such impossible for me to leave Saturday, wiring full information. I am in a state of great perplexity. Information has just been brought to me from sources entitled to belief that there are 2 men living in Atlanta who claim to have in time gone by, visited you by your invitation at night in your room at a hotel in this city. To marry you with these reports in force could not in any case be right or fair to either of us, even though they be untrue. Your reception in Atlanta would be so painfully affected thereby as to make me unwilling to bring you here and have you subjected to slights by people who you will have to meet. To carry you elsewhere would not avoid this treatment. The situation is horrible and difficult to handle. I must and will be kind and fair to you. We must and will not do that which, when done, cannot be undone. No man should marry any lady if he has any doubts that such a marriage could not be happy for both parties. It is far better to realize that fact before than after marriage. I know you so well and esteem you so highly that till I hear from you, I am sure you will agree that we should not, in justice to you and myself, go further now. I hope you will promptly reply to this in the same spirit as is written. Nothing has ever so disheartened me as this. I wooed and won you because I loved you. My heart is yet pure and true. I will not subject you unjustly to indignant, undeserved affront. Please think kindly of me as I now and evermore will of you. Sincerely, Asa G. Candler. Mailed Atlanta, September 15, 3:30 p.m. End quote. From Onezima to Candler. Quote, September 28. My attorney informs me that yesterday you refused to divulge the names of the men in Atlanta who you say claimed to have visited me there in my rooms for improper purposes. Do you expect me to let this hideous slander go unpunished? I'll publish it to the whole world, and we will see if the world is as credulous as you seem to be, and as you expect me to be. If there are any such men, and I certainly do not believe there are, who make such statements, they have been paid to do it, and they shall go to the penitentiary along with those who hired them. This is a clumsy conspiracy that imposes on nobody but you. Why did it come up in Atlanta right at the time, in fact just in time to stop you from coming to Reno for our wedding on the 20th? Why does it come up in Atlanta at all, except that it is distant from my home and friends, and where it will be harder for me to meet perjury and punish hired assassins? My attorney stated you said the man was a traveling salesman. That is a respectable class. I will call on the traveling salesman of the South to protect an innocent, defenseless woman from a dog, a cur. who is a tool of my enemy. You must divulge the name of this person. Unless you do, I'll act on the assumption that there is no such person and that you have been too willing to be imposed upon. Besides, you are a Christian gentleman. As a Christian gentleman, as a Christian, as a man of honor, can you treat a helpless woman this way? You know that I have not a single male relative in the world. I am not appealing to you as my promised husband and natural protector, but just as a man. Are you willing to see me treated this way in your city, in your home, where you are all powerful? Oh, how can you think for a minute that I ought to accept this insult in silence and humbly steal away in some remote place to hide the shame of a woman cast aside because she is not supposed to be a good woman? I'll never do it. I entreat you by our friendship in the name of the feelings of affection and attachment that have existed between us to go more deeply into this matter. You will find it false. It is a wicked, vicious attempt to destroy an innocent woman. I refuse to be made an outcast. If you will not comply with this request, I will come to Atlanta at the risk of public misconstruction against my every inclination. All I ask is plain justice. Sincerely, Onezima de Bushell. From Candler to Onezima. Quote, Atlanta, September 30th, 1922. There was no salutation. As promised, I am doing my best to get the actual truth of the statements made to me that reference was made to in my letter of September 15th, 1922. I have been told by a citizen of Atlanta that while you were a guest at the Piedmont Hotel during the reunion convention of the UCV, he saw you in room, at least 2 other ladies being also in the room. That afterward, he said he saw you alone in the corridor or hall of the hotel when he gave you his telephone number. Later, you telephoned him that you were alone in your room asking him to call. He declined, saying that the hotel was very carefully policed, that he did not visit ladies at their rooms in hotels. You assured him it would be perfectly safe that he visit you. He did not go. You gave him your home telephone, invited him to visit you when in New Orleans. He promised to do so. When in New Orleans, he telephoned to the number, but was informed that you were not then in New Orleans. I got the above statement by agreeing not to divulge his name until such time as he will consent. I am pursuing the investigation so privately that no publicity will result. Asa G. Candler. End quote. They would continue to write to each other, Onezima under a different name to prevent more talk, but nothing really comes of this. He refuses to give her the names, but continues to say that regardless, they can't get married. The last letter known is from October 5th. February 5th, 1924. Judge Sibley instructed the jury at length on the law with respect to validity of divorce decrees in the state of Nevada. He said the case hinged on the fact whether Mrs. de Bushell was domiciled in that state. If she was, then the state had a right to act. But if she was not a bona fide resident, then her divorce was illegal, although the court of Nevada may have recognized her as being such. If her divorce is valid, he said the state of Georgia must recognize it as such. Jury spent a whole 30 minutes deliberating, and they found for the defense, aka Candler, meaning Onezima did not win her suit. They only took 1 ballot. Neither of the main participants were in the court that day. Mr. Candler was found in the building bearing his name and would simply state, quote, I have no statement to make other than I am very happy. I didn't expect anything else, end quote. Her statement follows. Quote, while I freely confess surprise and disappointment that the validity of my divorce decree, which was rendered in Nevada and recognized by the courts of that state, may be affected by the verdict in this case, nevertheless, I am consoled by the fact that this defense was first made by Mr. Candler as a technical defense 12 months after he had filed his answer in court, admitting, under oath, substantially every assertion of my petition sustaining my character. The jury in this case, for technical legal reasons, were afforded no opportunity to condemn Mr. Candler and punish him for his inexcusable attack upon my character. An attack so inexcusable that upon the trial of this case, he offered no witness to sustain his reasons for breaking our engagement, and his counsel openly admitted that no attack of any kind could be made on me. While I have had no opportunity to consider further plans with reference to my decree, I will, of course, give this matter such prompt consideration as may be necessary for my own protection. In bringing the form of suit which I brought, I was advised by my counsel that it was my only resource and hope to develop the source of the rumors upon which Mr. Candler had broken his engagement. And it is my chief regret that the nature of the defense was such that I was cut off then, and I suppose forever, from exposing the utter want of foundation." End quote. February 18th, 1924. Oh dear, again. Candler can't seem to win in the twilight years love department. His current wife, again that's Mrs. May Little Reagan Candler, was arrested at a dive in the company of two men with a near-empty whiskey bottle found on the table near them. Now, remember, we're in the Prohibition days. Mrs. Candler would say as the police burst in, quote, "We were only having a little party. What's wrong in that? And besides, there are other people besides the Candlers in Atlanta." End quote. All of this hoopla involving love has aged Candler incredibly, say many, but he still believes in love, like Cher. Sweetum is now considered a household word. Now, I know Sweetum, or rather Sweetums, as a very large Muppet. Apparently, Candler calling his former fiancée Onezima that is now part of the lexicon. A well-known milling company has applied to use permission for the name on its stock feed. A candy company allegedly tried to use it also. Sweetum has also become a stock word for soft drinks. Well, anywho, Mrs. May Candler has been barred from the big mansion after her arrest. One of the men who was her companions there at the dive was a Mr. Stoddard, for whom she worked with as a stenographer for some 6 years before she got married. Now, I don't think there was anything nefarious going on besides the fact that it's prohibition and they're drinking whiskey. However, it sounds like Candler may be just about done. You know, your wife getting arrested with 2 men and a bottle of whiskey isn't a good look for a man of his prominence. But it's been many months. All of that was in February. It's now December 1924. Mrs. Candler can come back to the mansion. A reconciliation has been in process for a couple of months. Candler was the one allegedly that started the process. His thoughts? Quote, "This is purely a personal matter, and I decline to discuss it." End quote. Apparently, he did start divorce proceedings at the county court, but those were being held pending. Where has his wife May been all of these months? Living with her parents. Additionally to the arrest with liquor, she also hit a young girl with her car, and the child died. She was exonerated by the court. I'm not sure what the exact charge was, but I wouldn't doubt that there would be civil damages brought. Talk about a dark cloud. 1926. Candler's health has taken quite a turn. He now suffers from paralysis and is in a hospital with the right side of his body not working. 1929. Candler would pass away at the age of 78 at home, having been ill for over 2 years. He was still married to May at the time of his death. So no, he didn't have many loves, but the few loves he had left him widowed with children, left him in court, and left him probably questioning his choices, but hopefully in the end, it turned out fine. Happy New Year to you all. Best wishes for a good year. See you next week.